The streets of Milan echoed with the angry footsteps of disillusioned veterans. The year was 1919, and Italy was a nation in turmoil. Despite being among the victorious Allied powers of World War I, the Italian people felt cheated. The promises of territorial expansion and glory had turned to dust, leaving behind a bitter taste of what they called Vittoria Mutilata, the mutilated victory. In these chaotic times, a former socialist journalist named Benito Mussolini saw an opportunity. He had once been a prominent voice of the left, but the war had transformed him. Like many others, he had returned from the trenches a changed man, believing that only through nationalism and authoritarianism could Italy reclaim its ancient Roman glory. In smoke-filled cafes and on street corners, he began gathering followers, mostly fellow veterans and young men who felt betrayed by the existing political system. Meanwhile, across the Alps, Germany was experiencing an even more severe crisis. The Treaty of Versailles had struck the nation like a hammer blow. The proud German Empire was forced to accept sole responsibility for the war, pay massive reparations, and suffer territorial losses that cut deep into its national pride. The Kaiser had abdicated, and the new Weimar Republic was born in circumstances that would haunt it throughout its existence. In Munich, a city seething with resentment, soldiers returned to a Germany they barely recognized. The monarchy was gone, replaced by what many viewed as a weak democratic system. Communists and nationalists fought in the streets, while hyperinflation began to eat away at the savings of the middle class. Among these returning soldiers was an Austrian-born corporal named Adolf Hitler, who had found purpose and belonging in the army and was now adrift in civilian life. The foundations for fascism were being laid in both nations, though few recognized it at the time. The combination of wounded national pride, economic instability, and social upheaval created fertile ground for radical solutions. Traditional conservative elites, fearful of communist revolution, began to look the other way as violent right-wing groups emerged, seeing him as a useful counterforce to the left. In Italy, Mussolini founded the Fasci di Combattimento in 1919, marking the official birth of fascism as a political movement. The name came from the fasces, an ancient Roman symbol of authority, a bundle of rods bound together around an axe, representing strength through unity. In Germany, Hitler joined the German Workers' Party, soon to be renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nazi Party, beginning his rise from obscure veteran to political agitator. The first signs of what was to come appeared in the streets. Both movements organized paramilitaries, the black shirts in Italy and the brown shirts in Germany. These groups engaged in street fighting with leftist opponents, breaking up workers' meetings and intimidating political enemies. They presented themselves as restorers of order, even as they contributed to the very chaos they claimed to combat. By the end of 1919, both Italy and Germany were powder kegs waiting for a spark. The old order had been swept away by war, but what would replace it remained uncertain. Democratic institutions were new and fragile, economic problems mounted daily, and a generation of young men trained in violence sought an outlet for their frustrations. The stage was set for the rise of movements that would promise simple solutions to complex problems, offering the allure of strength and certainty in an age of weakness and doubt. As winter descended on Europe, few could have predicted the dark path that lay ahead. The wounds of World War I had not healed. Instead, they had festered, creating conditions that would give birth to ideologies even more destructive than the war itself. The first chapter in the rise of fascism was being written, and its consequences would reshape the world in ways that would haunt humanity for generations to come. The early 1920s witnessed the transformation of fringe extremist groups into formidable political forces. In Italy, Mussolini's black shirts had grown from a handful of angry veterans to a militia tens of thousands strong. They styled themselves as the defenders of order, yet their methods were anything but orderly. Armed squadristi roamed the countryside in trucks, targeting socialist organizations, trade unions, and anyone who opposed them. They burned newspaper offices, destroyed labor halls, and forced their opponents to drink castor oil, a humiliating form of torture that became their signature. The Italian state's response to this violence was tellingly weak. Many police and army officers sympathized with the fascists, seeing them as patriots fighting against the red menace of communism. Local authorities often turned a blind eye to fascist violence while cracking down harshly on left-wing resistance. The liberal government of Giovanni Giolitti even included fascists in their electoral alliance, hoping to use them as a tool against the left while maintaining control over them, a miscalculation that would prove fatal to Italian democracy. In Germany, Hitler was rapidly transforming the Nazi Party from an obscure political club into a movement that commanded attention. His gift for oratory became apparent in Munich's beer halls, where he would hold audiences spellbound with speeches that blamed Germany's troubles on an alleged conspiracy of Jews, Marxists, and democratic politicians. The party adopted its infamous swastika symbol, created the Sturmabteilung, SA, brown-shirted stormtroopers, and began to attract followers from all social classes. A crucial moment came in 1922 when Mussolini decided to seize power through his famous March on Rome. The reality was less dramatic than the myth. Rather than a spontaneous uprising, it was a carefully choreographed political theater. As thousands of black shirts converged on the capital, Italy's political establishment faced a choice: resist and risk civil war, or compromise with the fascists. King Victor Emmanuel III, urged by conservative advisers who saw Mussolini as a manageable alternative to socialism, refused to sign an order declaring martial law. Instead, he invited Mussolini to form a government. The next year, Hitler attempted to replicate Mussolini's success with the beer hall putsch in Munich. On November 8, 1923, he and his followers stormed a political meeting at the Bürgerbraukeller, declaring a national revolution. The next day, about 2,000 Nazi supporters marched through Munich, only to be met by police gunfire. Unlike in Italy, the German security forces remained loyal to the democratic government. The putsch failed, leaving 16 Nazi supporters and 4 police officers dead. Hitler was arrested and put on trial for treason. However, what could have been the end of his political career became instead a platform for propaganda. The sympathetic judge allowed Hitler to make lengthy political speeches during the trial, which received extensive press coverage. His conviction resulted in a lenient sentence at Landsberg prison, where he would write Mein Kampf, outlining his political ideology and plans for Germany's future. These early years revealed crucial differences between the Italian and German fascist movements. Mussolini's ideology was relatively flexible, focused primarily on the cult of action and national greatness. The Italian fascists were opportunists who adapted their program to attract support from industrialists, the Catholic Church, and conservative elites. In contrast, Hitler's National Socialism was more rigidly ideological, centered on racial theories and militant anti-Semitism. Both movements, however, shared key characteristics that would define fascism. They rejected democracy and individual rights in favor of national unity under a strong leader. They glorified violence and war, and they promised to restore national greatness through the elimination of internal enemies and the conquest of new territory. They also pioneered modern techniques of propaganda and mass mobilization, using rallies, symbols, and media to create an emotional connection with their followers. The period also demonstrated the fatal weakness of democratic institutions in both countries. In Italy, the liberal state proved unwilling to defend itself against fascist violence, while in Germany, the Weimar Republic's tolerance of anti-democratic forces would eventually prove its undoing. Economic instability, inflation in Germany, labor unrest in Italy, created an atmosphere of crisis that made radical solutions appear increasingly attractive. By the mid-1920s, Mussolini was consolidating his power in Italy, gradually transforming his coalition government into a dictatorship. In Germany, Hitler emerged from prison determined to achieve power through legal means, rebuilding the Nazi Party into a more effective organization. The stage was set for the next phase in the rise of fascism, as both movements prepared to eliminate the last vestiges of democracy in their respective nations. The years between 1925 and 1934 marked the critical period when both Italian fascism and German Nazism transformed from political movements into absolute dictatorships. In Italy, the turning point came with the murder of socialist deputy Giacomo Matteotti in 1924. Matteotti had publicly denounced fascist violence and electoral fraud, and his assassination by fascist thugs sparked a political crisis that could have ended Mussolini's rule. Instead, on January 3, 1925, Mussolini took responsibility for the political climate that led to the murder and brazenly declared his intention to establish a dictatorship. What followed in Italy was the systematic dismantling of democratic institutions. The free press was muzzled, opposition parties were banned, and local governments were placed under the control of fascist officials. The parliament became a rubber stamp for Mussolini's decisions. New laws created a political police force, the OVRA, which hunted down anti-fascist dissidents. Labor unions were replaced by state-controlled corporations that supposedly represented both workers and employers, but in reality served to suppress workers' rights and maintain social control. The fascist state penetrated every aspect of Italian life. Children joined youth organizations like the Balilla, where they were indoctrinated in fascist ideology and trained for future military service. Women were relegated to traditional roles as mothers, with the regime offering incentives for large families while restricting their professional opportunities. The Battle for Births campaign aimed to increase Italy's population for future military expansion. Culture, too, was transformed, with artists and intellectuals pressured to serve the regime's goals or face ostracism. In Germany, Hitler's path to absolute power took a different route but reached a similar destination. The Great Depression hit Germany particularly hard, destabilizing the Weimar Republic and radicalizing voters. The Nazi Party grew dramatically, becoming the largest party in the Reichstag by 1932. Conservative leaders, led by former Chancellor Franz von Papen, convinced President Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as Chancellor in January 1933, believing they could control him. This fatal miscalculation would soon destroy German democracy. The crucial moment came with the Reichstag fire in February 1933. When the Parliament building was set ablaze, Hitler convinced Hindenburg to sign an emergency decree suspending civil liberties. The Nazis blamed the fire on a communist conspiracy, using it as a pretext to arrest thousands of leftist opponents. The following month, Hitler pushed through the Enabling Act, which gave him dictatorial powers. Only the Social Democrats dared to vote against it, while communist deputies were already in prison or in hiding. The Nazi consolidation of power was swift and brutal. Opposition parties were banned, trade unions were dissolved, and their assets seized. The civil service was purged of unreliable elements, Jews, leftists, and Democrats. In the Night of the Long Knives, in June 1934, Hitler ordered the murder of SA leader Ernst Röhm and hundreds of others, including conservative critics like von Papen's associates. When President Hindenburg died in August 1934, Hitler combined the offices of Chancellor and President, becoming the absolute ruler of Germany. The Nazi regime went further than Italian fascism in its totalitarian ambitions. The concept of Gleichschaltung, coordination, meant bringing every aspect of society under Nazi control. Professional organizations, youth groups, and cultural institutions were all Nazified. The Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls encompassed most of the country's young people. Education was reformed to emphasize racial ideology and military virtues. The press became a propaganda machine under Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Most ominously, both regimes began implementing their radical visions of national purification. In Italy, this mainly took the form of Italianization, forcing minority groups to adopt Italian language and culture, particularly in newly annexed territories. The Nazi regime's racial policies were far more extreme. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 stripped Jews of their citizenship and prohibited marriages between Jews and non-Jews. A series of escalating persecutions would follow, driving many Jews to emigrate and setting the stage for even more terrible events to come. The economic policies of both regimes reflected their corporate state ideologies. In Italy, Mussolini's battle for grain and land reclamation projects aimed at agricultural self-sufficiency, while state intervention in industry increased. Nazi Germany pursued autarky, economic self-sufficiency, even more aggressively, implementing four-year plans that prioritized rearmament and military preparation. Both economies became increasingly militarized, with state-directed investment and production geared toward eventual war. By the mid-1930s, both Hitler and Mussolini had achieved what seemed impossible a decade earlier. They had destroyed democracy and established totalitarian states. Their success relied on a combination of violence and legal manipulation, exploitation of economic crises, and the fatal weakness of democratic institutions and their defenders. The stage was now set for the next phase, the pursuit of territorial expansion and military glory that would ultimately lead to World War II. By the mid-1930s, fascism had evolved from a radical political experiment in Italy and Germany into an international movement that threatened to reshape the entire European order. The success of Hitler and Mussolini inspired imitators across the continent, from Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists to the Romanian Iron Guard, from the Spanish Falange to the Croatian Ustes. The ideology that had been born in Milan's streets now seemed to many like the wave of the future. The first major international test came with Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. Mussolini, desperate to prove Italy's great power status and provide an outlet for nationalist ambitions, launched a brutal colonial war. The Italian military employed chemical weapons against Ethiopian forces and civilians, committing what would today be considered war crimes. The League of Nations proved powerless to stop the aggression, imposing limited sanctions that neither prevented Italy's conquest nor seriously damaged its economy. This failure emboldened other aggressive powers and demonstrated the international community's weakness. Meanwhile, Hitler was systematically dismantling the Versailles Treaty's restrictions on Germany. In 1935, he openly announced German rearmament, including the creation of an air force, the Luftwaffe, and the reintroduction of universal military service. The following year, German troops marched into the demilitarized Rhineland. France and Britain, still traumatized by the First World War and pursuing a policy of appeasement, did nothing. Their inaction convinced Hitler that the Western democracies lacked the will to oppose his expansionist plans. The Spanish Civil War, 1936-1939, became a crucial testing ground for fascist military power and international resolve. When right-wing generals led by Francisco Franco rebelled against Spain's democratic government, both Hitler and Mussolini provided substantial military support. German aircraft bombed the Basque town of Guernica, a horrific preview of the strategic bombing campaigns to come. The Western democracies maintained an official policy of non-intervention, while the Soviet Union provided limited aid to the Spanish Republic. The eventual victory of Franco's forces seemed to confirm fascism's unstoppable momentum. The year 1938 marked a series of triumphs for Nazi Germany. In March, Hitler engineered the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria into the German Reich. The Austrian Nazi Party seized power, and German troops were welcomed by cheering crowds in Vienna. A few months later, Hitler turned his attention to the Sudetenland, the German-speaking regions of Czechoslovakia. At the Munich conference in September, Britain and France, still pursuing appeasement, agreed to the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain famously declared he had achieved peace for our time. Mussolini, meanwhile, was drawing closer to Nazi Germany. Initially skeptical of Hitler and protective of Austrian independence, he gradually aligned Italy with the more powerful German Reich. The intervention in Spain, the formation of the Rome-Berlin Axis in 1936, and Italy's adoption of anti-Jewish racial laws in 1938 marked this shift. The signing of the Pact of Steel in 1939 formalized the military alliance between the two fascist powers. The Nazi regime's increasingly aggressive anti-Jewish policies sent shockwaves through Europe. The Kristallnacht pogrom of November 1938 saw synagogues burned, Jewish businesses destroyed, and tens of thousands of Jews arrested. Yet international response remained limited to diplomatic protests. Many countries restricted Jewish immigration precisely when it was most desperately needed, reflecting both anti-Semitism and fear of domestic political consequences. Economic preparation for war accelerated in both countries. Germany's four-year plan, directed by Hermann Göring, focused on developing synthetic substitutes for strategic materials and maximizing military production. Italian industry, though less efficient, was also increasingly militarized. Both regimes faced the challenge of maintaining popular support while directing resources away from civilian consumption toward rearmament. In the cultural sphere, both regimes intensified their efforts to create new men shaped by fascist values. Youth organizations became increasingly militarized. Education emphasized racial ideology in Germany and imperial destiny in Italy. The media hammered home messages of national greatness and the inevitability of conflict. Architecture, film, and public ceremonies celebrated the fascist aesthetic of power and uniformity. The final steps toward war came rapidly in 1939. In March, Hitler broke the Munich Agreement by occupying the rest of Czechoslovakia. In May, Germany and Italy formalized their alliance with the Pact of Steel. The stunning announcement of the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact in August removed the last obstacle to German aggression. On September 1, 1939, German forces invaded Poland, triggering British and French declarations of war. The road to war revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of fascist rule. The regimes had successfully mobilized their societies for conflict and overcome most internal opposition. Their military forces, particularly Germany's, had been modernized and expanded. Yet their economies remained vulnerable, their diplomatic isolation grew, and they faced the prospect of conflict with far more powerful industrial nations. The fascist bid for European domination was about to face its ultimate test in a war that would prove far more terrible than even the First World War. The catastrophic finale of fascist rule in Italy and Germany demonstrated the ultimate consequences of their ideological extremism and militant nationalism. World War II, which began as a bid for continental domination, would end in unprecedented destruction and human suffering, forever linking fascism with some of humanity's darkest moments. The initial phase of the war seemed to validate fascist militarism. Germany's blitzkrieg tactics overwhelmed Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France in quick succession. Mussolini, not wanting to miss out on what appeared to be an easy victory, declared war on France and Britain in June 1940, though Italian forces proved far less effective than their German allies. The Nazi regime reached the apex of its power in 1941, controlling territory from the Atlantic to the outskirts of Moscow, from Norway to North Africa. However, beneath this apparent triumph lay fatal weaknesses. The decision to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941 exposed the regime's ideological rigidity and strategic incompetence. The war in the East became a brutal struggle of annihilation, with the Nazi regime implementing its racial policies through the systematic murder of Jews, Slavs, and other groups deemed subhuman. The Holocaust, which would claim the lives of 6 million European Jews, represented the ultimate expression of fascist racial ideology. Mussolini's regime began to crumble first. Military defeats in Greece, North Africa, and the Soviet Union exposed Italy's weakness. Allied bombing devastated Italian cities, while food shortages and economic hardship eroded civilian morale. In July 1943, following the Allied invasion of Sicily, the Fascist Grand Council voted to remove Mussolini from power. The Italian people, who had once cheered Il Duce, now celebrated his fall. However, Italy's suffering was not over. The German army occupied northern Italy, installing Mussolini as a puppet ruler of a rump fascist state, while the country descended into civil war between fascists and partisans. The Nazi regime proved more resilient, fighting on even as Allied bombing reduced German cities to rubble and Soviet forces advanced from the east. Hitler's refusal to consider surrender or tactical retreat turned military defeats into catastrophes. Yet the regime maintained its grip on German society almost until the end, continuing the Holocaust even as military resources grew scarce. In the war's final months, Hitler ordered the implementation of scorched earth policies in Germany itself, demonstrating fascism's ultimately nihilistic nature. The human cost of fascist rule was staggering. Beyond the military casualties of World War II, which exceeded 50 million worldwide, the Nazi regime's racial policies led to the systematic murder of millions of civilians. The Holocaust became the defining genocide of the 20th century, implemented with industrial efficiency and bureaucratic precision. Less well known but also significant were other Nazi mass-killing programs, including the murder of disabled people, Roma, and millions of Soviet prisoners of war. The material destruction was equally unprecedented. Much of Europe lay in ruins, its industrial infrastructure devastated, its cities bombed into rubble. Germany itself was divided and occupied, its major cities destroyed, its population traumatized and displaced. Italy, though less physically damaged, emerged from the war impoverished and politically fragmented. The economic achievements claimed by fascist regimes in the 1930s were revealed as largely illusory, based on unsustainable militarization and plunder. The post-war period saw determined efforts to prevent fascism's return. The Nuremberg trials established new principles of international law, including individual responsibility for crimes against humanity. Denazification programs in Germany attempted to remove fascist influence from society, though their effectiveness varied. Italy's transition was less systematic but still marked by a strong rejection of fascist ideology. New democratic constitutions in both countries included safeguards against authoritarian takeovers. The legacy of fascism profoundly influenced post-war political development. The horrors of Nazi rule created a strong commitment to human rights and democracy in Western Europe. The European integration project, beginning with the coal and steel community, was explicitly designed to make war between European nations impossible. The United Nations, established in 1945, reflected the international community's determination to prevent the recurrence of fascist aggression and genocide. Yet fascism's impact extended beyond political and institutional changes. The Holocaust fundamentally altered Jewish life and identity, while also becoming a universal symbol of evil and a warning about the potential for human cruelty. The psychological trauma of fascist rule affected generations, influencing everything from family dynamics to cultural expression. Artists, writers, and philosophers struggled to make sense of how advanced societies could descend into such barbarism. The study of fascism became crucial for understanding political extremism and mass manipulation. Scholars analyzed how modern societies could produce totalitarian movements, highlighting the importance of democratic institutions and civil society. The rise of fascism demonstrated how economic crisis, social upheaval, and wounded national pride could combine to make radical solutions attractive to millions of otherwise ordinary people. In the 21st century, the legacy of fascism remains relevant. The symbols and methods of fascist movements continue to influence extremist groups, while the debate over how to combat such movements remains vital to democratic societies. The rise of populist and nationalist movements in various countries has prompted renewed discussion of fascism's warning signs and the importance of defending democratic institutions. The ultimate lesson of fascism's rise and fall is perhaps that no society is immune to the appeal of authoritarian solutions in times of crisis. The responsibility to prevent history's repetition rests with each generation's commitment to democratic values, human rights, and the rejection of ideologies based on hatred and exclusion. The story of fascism's rise serves as both a warning about humanity's capacity for evil and a reminder of the precious fragility of democratic civilization.